Putin has been hit the hardest so far. The Russian army is now left with a huge desperation. Putin, who wanted to launch an attack on Ukraine through Donetsk, was suddenly faced with a very big problem. The train that was going to provide weapons and ammunition to the soldiers in Donetsk was shaken by a very big explosion. After these developments, Putin's plan has been dealt a huge blow by the United States. Zelensky took a very big step after Joe Biden's critical visit. After this step, Putin had to withdraw his troops from many regions. With these developments, Russian agents were hunted down by Romania this time, and Putin is completely cornered. In the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian army continues to fight in a very critical way. As a result of his superiority in certain regions and making his dominance felt in many areas, especially after the coup process, Putin decided to take action. But as a prominent point in this transition process, it is now shown that the Ukrainian army is based on the borders of Donetsk. However, it is known that Ukraine, which is gaining more and more strength against the Russians, now has the power to liberate most regions from the Russian occupation. It was precisely at this point that Putin decided to make a very big breakthrough by creating a more solid defense line against Ukraine and heading for Kiev. He took action by sending all the military ammunition he had towards the main ammunition he had towards of Donetsk, quarters of darkness. But the surprise he encountered at this point allowed the Russian army to suffer one of the biggest defeats it has ever suffered. The Ukrainian army predicted that Putin would send support in the near future thanks to the dominance he had established over Donetsk. However, the Ukrainian army immediately took action and he decided to send intelligence troops to all the routes where the Russians could send possible ammunition support. Ukrainian intelligence officers have started analyzing this region and mapping all the places in the region with the unmanned aerial vehicles they have. With this latest step, the Ukrainian army has blockaded all possible routes of the Russians by land. After that, it was learned that the Russian army would try a different way for the defense line. After this information given by Ukrainian agents in the Russian army, the Ukrainian army immediately took action, and he completely cornered the Russians. The Ukrainian army has learned that a very large ammunition train is approaching this area. However, possible railways were identified one by one. There was a railway in Donetsk near one of the ammunition depots, the location of which was previously known to the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian military predicted that this critical shipment of ammunition would arrive exactly from this point, and he mobilized the most important Ukrainian Special Forces troops at his disposal. At this point, the measures taken by the Ukrainian army against a possible failure were of a nature that would surprise the whole world. The Ukrainian army has started using Hedgehog armored vehicles to go near this region in advance. It was very important at this point that the points where the railway passes have the character of a valley. The sabotage troops immediately mobilized. They had brought with them a large number of remote-controlled fours to be aligned in the middle of the railway. The Ukrainian army immediately began laying them on the railway. The information that the train that will carry ammunition and supplies to the Russian army is on its way has come to the Ukrainian army, and the Ukrainian soldiers moved to the two slopes and began to wait. When Putin made this shipment, he did not think that the Ukrainian army could penetrate so far inland. Because of this, he did not take enough security precautions. And whether the Ukrainian army has the power to organize operations in this region, it has experienced very severely in return for the imprudence of the train that was going to deliver aid to Russian soldiers. The Ukrainian army made a huge profit, and the observer troops waiting in the last parts of Donetsk gave the news that the train was approaching this area. The Ukrainian army has dealt a huge blow to the Russians after this news as the train was moving from the railway towards Donetsk. It was faced with a very big jolt. The Ukrainian army had detonated the C4s it had laid on the railway track just as the train was passing by. However, the train carrying ammunition to the Russian army derailed. The soldiers who were responsible for guarding the ammunition inside the train got out, and he tried to figure out what had happened. Part of the ammunition train was completely on fire. The Russian army immediately took cover and moved to stand up to possible threats. As a result of the correct deployment of Ukrainian soldiers on the hillside, the Russian army did not know what to do. While the mutual conflicts were continuing, the Russian soldiers seemed to be prepared for this situation, and they began to take the lead in the shootout. The Ukrainian army did not know what to do at this point, and he contacted the center in case of failure of the operation. Ukraine's backup plan would be activated, and with the orders given by Kiev, the Russian army is completely cornered this time. Before this operation, Ukraine had moved its important unmanned aerial vehicles to nearby airports. Such a measure was necessary because the sensitivity of the Russian army about Donetsk is known. Ukraine has started to activate unmanned aerial vehicles. Putin's lack of an active air defense system protecting Donetsk laid the groundwork for the success of this operation, which will be organized by the Ukrainian army. The soldiers near the train began to move away and retreat while the Russian army was trying to celebrate its false victory. It realized that they could not establish the slightest connection with the Kremlin. This had brought a great disappointment before the Russian soldiers realized what had happened. It turned out that the Ukrainian army had left the signal jammers in this area and moved away. The Russian army realized that it had to collect the ammunition as soon as possible, but the Ukrainian drones had already taken off, and this would have dealt a huge blow to the Russian army. When the unmanned aerial vehicles of the Ukrainian army arrived in the region, they knew a very important detail. This was the Ukrainian army's opinion about which of the train's wagons was loaded with explosives from the beginning. This wagon, identified as could not be detonated by Ukrainian soldiers. The unmanned aerial vehicles went directly to low altitude, and he began shelling towards the wagon, which the Russian army took the greatest care to protect. With that, the Russian soldiers began to flee right and left while some of them retreated. The other part was taken prisoner, thanks to the offensive of the Ukrainian army. After this successful operation, the Ukrainian army showed the whole world who was the judge of Donetsk. But it was precisely at this point that Vladimir Putin made a critical statement. Putin's words, which stated that Donetsk belongs to Russia, shook the whole world. Russian President Vladimir Putin has made it clear that he will continue his attacks in the Ukrainian region. These statements have caused great repercussions all over the world. He explained that no matter what steps the Ukrainian soldiers will take in recent days, they will not have enough success against the Russian army and will continue to send ammunition to Donetsk guys. In addition, according to the information obtained by the Ukrainian army, it was also learned that Russia will launch the attack from a different region as a result of the weakening of political relations with Belarus. The fact that this region is the Donetsk region, which is described as more critical towards Ukraine, was met with surprise by everyone. Because of this, the West has rolled up its sleeves to prevent all kinds of ammunition shipments coming to Donetsk, and the USA has taken action. The United States has been making statements of support for the Ukrainian army since the beginning of the war. However, it is known to the whole world that a very serious support package has also been sent to the Ukrainian army. The latest developments that have emerged have also had a quality that confirms them. The Ukrainian army has managed to put itself ahead in the regions where the war has been the most difficult in recent days. But this was supposed to get an extra support from outside against Putin's recent statements. For this, the United States has taken action in a surprise visit. He requested a meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. As a result of this meeting, many decisions that will resonate all over the world have come back to back. Joe Biden said that they will do everything in their power to change the current situation in Ukraine. The most important of these was Biden's words. No matter how long it takes, it is worth fighting for freedom against Russia. It has once again been revealed how much effort Biden and many European Union countries have made to ensure that the Ukrainian army can win the war. However, Biden had come to this region not only to make these statements, but also to announce a new package of support. And the quality and financial strength of this support package has stunned the whole world. Biden announced that the United States will provide a new $2.1 billion support to the Ukrainian military under the Ukrainian Security Assistance Initiative. However, the financial resources that the Ukrainian army now needs in many areas have been completed. These statements showed the whole world how great a power had also taken action against Russia at some point. Biden added that this state of alliance will continue continuously. Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea will be retaken in the nearest future. These statements, on the other hand, caused great repercussions in the Russian media. As a result of this news published by Russian newspapers, Donetsk faced many question marks about its own security. Although the people of Donetsk reacted strongly against Putin's invasion at many points, Putin's attitude towards them was quite different. Immediately after these news were made, Putin took action and he did not hesitate to use the only basis that kept the regime going. After this news, Putin immediately began to send the National Guard, known as his personal army, to this region. Even within the group working to ensure calm in this region, there were people who had many question marks about Putin's regime. Putin immediately took this news off the air. He was also aware that his authority had been seriously reduced, especially after the coup attempt. Although he tried to silence people by using the pressure he had as a solution to these, he could not succeed when he realized that he could not send enough troops there against a possible attack from Donetsk. He also made the critical decision, and he began to withdraw the Russian soldiers. Putin was surprised at what the United States would do after these statements. Behind the rhetoric, such as some troops in Donetsk laying down weapons, Putin decided to make breakthroughs to give confidence to the army again at the beginning of these, although he promised that the necessary ammunition and weapons deficit of the Russian army would be closed. He did not receive the necessary compensation. He began to send the National Guard to the region, which he had in order to increase the authority of the central government. Putin, who based the inspection of this region on increasing the soldiers in the army a little more and making it more manageable, was also accused of creating another army from the Russian army at this point. But the real trouble was very different. The Russian soldiers who were forced to retreat from Donetsk had created a great position for the Ukrainian army, and the Ukrainian army has moved to assess this position. The Ukrainian army has started using the equipment it has in its possession to identify important points of the region. When he realized that the second military headquarters in the westernmost part of Donetsk had been evacuated, he lay in wait. The Ukrainian army, which entered just as the Russian soldiers left this region, immediately hung a flag on the military headquarters and stated that it had captured this region. This incident has made the people of Donetsk, who are already uncomfortable with the Putin administration, even more angry. The people of Donetsk, who have been constantly victimized by Putin's unstable rule, have decided to organize protests again. Either way, it is eagerly awaited what Putin, who has reached an impasse, will do after these developments. But things are going the opposite way for the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army was aware of how great an advantage it had gained over the Russians on the back of these latest news of support. Zelensky stated that he will march on the Russian army with more confidence than ever, especially since such news creates a big game on the morale of the army. Zelensky, who has jumped the age both in establishing a defensive line and in being able to manage the offensive line with the support he has received in recent days, is expected to claim victory in a short time. It is known that the Ukrainian army, which is developing and advancing further with these news, can ensure the freedom of the surrounding countries by taking a number of different steps every day. But the last move, which will completely corner the Russian army, has caused great repercussions all over the world. The fact that the most important administrative units of the Russian army suffered such great damage has once again revealed Putin's incompetence. And as a result of this move, the Ukrainian army has acquired a significant lead, and the decisive move has been made by the Ukrainian army. The Russian general, Valery Gerasimov, who had been dispatched to Ukraine, was assassinated. Putin decided to organize visits to Russian troops on Ukrainian soil to improve morale, and he decided to send specific high-level Russian officials to Ukraine every month. During his visit to Ukraine, Russian General Valery Gerasimov was killed with the attempted assassination of Gerasimov. Russian President Vladimir Putin has collected Russian Special Forces personnel surrounding the Kremlin Palace. Vladimir Putin, who has recently had to cope with upheavals inside the Russian army, is making a concerted attempt to reclaim control of the force. Many issues, such as Russian soldiers' decision to lay down their guns and anti-war protests inside the Russian government's headquarters, are placing pressure on the Russian leadership. One of the main causes for this is Putin's tough policies against his own army. Putin has sent senior Russian officials to Ukrainian territory in order to return Russian servicemen to his side and allow them to meet with Russian forces. In recent months, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has visited numerous Russian command posts and met with Russian servicemen. Shoigu, who personally listened to Russian soldiers' grievances, promised that all of these issues will be resolved. Recognizing the value of this orchestrated tour, Putin quickly requested that Russian General Valery Gerasimov visit some Russian offices on Ukrainian soil. Gerasimov, who began his visits to Zaporizhia, was slain at the first headquarters he visited. The attempted assassination of Gerasimov made a tremendous splash on the global agenda. Putin immediately gathered Russian Special Forces personnel at the Kremlin residence and began tightening security measures. In terms of the new specifics, Vladimir Putin appointed Valery Gerasimov to the position after General Sergei Surovikin, the previous leader of the Russian army, was fired. According to Gerasimov, he was able to acquire the respect of Russian soldiers quickly after his arrival. However, with the recent disruption in supply and ammunition shipments to Ukraine, Russian forces' morale and enthusiasm began to plummet. Vladimir Putin decided to send General Gerasimov to Ukraine in order to rebuild the army and demonstrate his concern for Russian servicemen. Vladimir Putin has also visited Mariupol in recent months. While visiting a Russian headquarters in Zaporizhia, Gerasimov was assaulted by unmanned combat aircraft. Gerasimov visited the Russian headquarters in Zaporizhia, one of the Russian army's control districts, and held one-on-one talks with soldiers to satisfy their requirements. Gerasimov was about to leave the headquarters when he was assaulted by unmanned combat aircraft, 3 unmanned aerial vehicles. Olives were spotted near the headquarters 20 minutes after Gerasimov entered it. When the Russian forces noticed the UAVs approaching the headquarters, they opened fire on them when Russian forces opened fire. 2 of the unmanned combat planes were successfully shot down. However, the final remaining UAV infiltrated the headquarters and conducted a missile attack on Gerasimov's building. When the missile hit the building where General Gerasimov was, there was a huge explosion. The missile that struck the building's roof caused extensive damage. After carrying out the attack, the drone immediately moved away from the region and was never seen again. Gerasimov was quickly removed from the building, followed by Russian forces and taken to the nearest shelter. Gerasimov attempted to contact the Kremlin after learning of the attack. However, because Gerasimov was in the bunker, no news could be received. Concerned by the recent attack on the Kremlin palace, Putin promptly collected Russian Special Forces troops surrounding the Kremlin palace. Hours later, Russian General Valery Gerasimov crossed the border and was whisked away to the Kremlin residence. As a result, it was discovered that the attack had failed and that Gerasimov was still alive. Although the Russian authorities blamed Ukraine for the attack, Ukrainian officials said nothing about it. Following the recent murder attempts on Vladimir Putin, security measures have begun to be tightened. Putin is said to have been assassinated twice since the war began. The British authorities were able to identify one of these assassination attempts. The British authorities, who discovered substantial damage to Vladimir Putin's armored limousine's front right wheel, stated that an armed attack had recently occurred on Putin's vehicle. Months after this incident, he planned to launch an unmanned aerial vehicle strike on the Kremlin palace. The Russian army destroyed the UAVs that managed to enter the Kremlin residence in the air. Putin, who has begun to lose the war for Ukrainian land, has recently experienced a bout of paranoia. Putin, having lost control of the army, is attempting to fight with his own people. Russia has become increasingly isolated as a result of Putin's deceptive rhetoric and policies in both home and foreign affairs. Several European countries are now imposing sanctions and embargoes on Russia. This places the Russian economy in a tough position. Although Putin wants the sanctions repealed, European countries are determined to keep them in place. Many economists believe that Russia is on the verge of a financial collapse if current trends continue. The ramifications of this are already being felt in Russia. Rising inflation rates are being noticed in grocery and technology prices. Rising prices have begun to have a significant impact on the Russian population. Russian citizens are suddenly having difficulty finding the things they desire. The Russian people did not feel the negative effects of the war in the early months of the war. As a result, many who backed Vladimir Putin also supported the Russian army's invasion of Ukrainian territory. However, the outbreak of conflict and Russia's economic collapse have left even Putin's supporters in a tough position. The scenario that puts Putin in the most trouble is that of Russia's minority inhabitants. As is well known, the vast majority of soldiers enlisted in the army as a result of the partial mobilization decision are Russian minority. when it was discovered that more than half of the troops forcefully recruited into the army were minorities, minorities began to oppose the situation. Minority citizens began to go to the streets in various places, particularly in Dagestan and the Crimean Peninsula, to organize anti-Putin and anti-war protests. Putin, on the other side, acted aggressively as usual in suppressing these protests. Putin dispatched Russian security troops to protest regions, barring minority citizens from demonstrating. As a result, these demonstrations were quickly put down after the Russian military began invading Ukrainian land. Russian President Vladimir Putin prohibited all anti-war news reports within Russia's borders. Many Russian national television outlets were penalized for airing anti-war programming. But recently, everything appears to be going as Putin desires. In the early months of the war, Putin jailed some journalists who raised an anti-war banner on live television. The Russian government, which contradicts the Ukrainian government's war data, does not want to reveal the casualties incurred during the war. Russian officials who claim that the information is a state secret have stated that they will not reveal it. However, based on the casualties acknowledged by the Ukrainian government, Russia has lost more than 200,000 troops in Ukraine. Russian individuals have begun to use the internet to follow the conflict in Ukraine on their own. However, after a while, Putin began to block these news websites as well. Access to around 200,000 websites has been blocked since the beginning of the war. Furthermore, the VPN application used to access these sites is prohibited in Russia. Putin continues to oppress the Russian people in his usual tyrannical fashion. Following these developments, the Ukrainian government has placed a $1 million bounty on the head of convicted General Sergei Surovikin. According to a joint decision made by the US and Ukrainian governments, the individual who captures Russian General Sergei Surovikin alive would receive a $1 million reward. Surovikin, who had earlier been sacked for committing war crimes on Ukrainian territory, had become a target of US officials. Sergei Surovikin's misdeeds in Ukraine had earlier forced Russian President Vladimir Putin to remove him. A major effort has now been undertaken to capture Sergei Surovikin, who was appointed by Vladimir Putin after the Russian army began to lose the fight on Ukrainian land in recent months. Immediately began bombing civilian areas on Ukrainian territory. Surovikin, known as a criminal general, has previously committed several war crimes with the men under his command while serving in Syria. The International Criminal Court has issued a search warrant for Sergei Surovikin for war crimes committed in Syria and has issued arrest warrants. Surovikin's offenses could not be substantiated. Hence, the prosecution was withdrawn after the Russian army entered Ukraine. Putin ordered the recall of Russian General Surovikin and the men under his command to Russian soil following Surovikin's return to Russia. Putin fired Russian General Alexander Levin as commander of the Russian army, and Sergei Surovikin was named in his place. Sergei Surovikin, a novice to the role, carried out numerous attacks on Ukrainian land in order to reawaken public interest in Russian forces. Surovikin, who also led the Russian contingent on Ukrainian territory, had these soldiers particularly assigned to him. The major mission of these men was to conduct unmanned combat aircraft strikes against Ukrainian residential areas in order to terrorize the Ukrainian civilians who live there. As a result, Ukrainian civilians would evacuate these areas, making the Russian army's job easier. However, things quickly became out of hand, and the men under Surovikin's direction proceeded to pillage on Ukrainian land. Russian forces began breaking into houses abandoned by Ukrainian civilians, seizing goods and selling them within Russia's borders. Surovikin's recent order to attack the city of Dnipro, on the other hand, drew worldwide attention. A considerable number of buildings and cars in Dnipro were damaged as a result of the long-range Iskander missile bombardment. Following that, the US and Ukrainian governments petitioned the International Criminal Court to punish and arrest Sergei Surovikin. Recognizing that Surovikin would be imprisoned, Putin abruptly fired him and nominated Russian General Valery Gerasimov to the position. The US authorities have now pursued Surovikin once more, announcing a $1 million prize for the army or person who captures General Sergei Surovikin. In terms of the new specifics following the US and Ukrainian governments' combined decision, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky released a declaration during his parliamentary speech. This public announcement also referenced the long-missing Russian commander, Sergei Surovikin's name. Surovikin's abrupt disappearance. While his prosecution for war crimes committed in Ukraine was still proceeding, enraged Ukrainian officials, Zelensky, who also privately addressed pro-Ukrainian and Russian persons living in Russia, promised that whomever brought Sergei Surovikin alive would be paid with $1 million. Following Zelensky's declaration, a search warrant was issued for Sergei Surovikin by the United States. Surovikin, who has not been seen in public for a long time, is thought to be being hidden by Putin. If Surovikin is apprehended and confesses, both Vladimir Putin and Russia could face massive compensation claims as a result. It is critical that Surovikin be apprehended and forced to speak. Following this incident, Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a regulation mandating that soldiers who robbed on Ukrainian soil face prison time. Russian soldiers detected looting would be deported to Russia and sentenced to between 5 and 10 years in prison. However, it is evident from the videos and photographs released on Telegram channels that Russian soldiers continued to loot. Putin appears to have made this decision only to avoid pressure from the United States and Western countries. Many allegations have previously been leveled against General Sergei Surovikin. Surovikin, according to one of these accusations, was planning a coup. Many believe that Surovikin was fired by Putin because he planned to stage a coup. Surovikin's fast climb to prominence and complete control of the Russian army posed a significant challenge to Vladimir Putin. The Russian people were furious with Vladimir Putin at the moment. The Russian economy was going through a difficult era as a result of sanctions placed by the US and Western countries on Russia, as well as the Russian military demanding significant expenses. Protests have begun to be organized in numerous Russian cities. A big number of people were organizing rallies against the Putin dictatorship and the conflict on Ukrainian territory. These demonstrations have the potential to undermine Putin's authority. It is now extremely simple for a newly appearing name to cause a stir because the Russian people's patience had run out and they were furious. It was also claimed that this coup would be carried out by Sergei Surovikin. Surovikin developed a stronghold over the Russian army after Vladimir Putin delegated complete command of the army to him. Surovikin, who was beloved by Russian soldiers for the attacks he carried out, became the most talked about name in Russia overnight. However, Putin is becoming increasingly concerned about the situation. As a result, Sergei Surovikin ranked first on the list of those capable of carrying out a coup. These claims are thought to be the reason Vladimir Putin fired Sergei Surovikin. However, nothing definitive has been established. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky requested that Putin be charged before the International Criminal Court for a variety of reasons. The decision to arrest Vladimir Putin was made by the criminal court last month. Vladimir Putin's attempt to deport Ukrainian residents on Ukrainian territory to Russia resulted in his prosecution. As is well known, Putin dispatched a large number of Russian officials to Ukraine, and Russian passports were issued to Ukrainian individuals. Ukrainian citizens who refused to leave were forcibly carried to Russia's borders by Russian forces. As a result, Putin has been issued an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court for the past 16 months. The Russian army has occupied Ukrainian territory, while the entire world awaits the deconfliction of the war between Russia and Ukraine. The intensity of the battle grows by the day, however. The fight began to shift in favor of Ukraine, this time, for the first time. Pro-Ukrainian fighters of the Russian Freedom Legion captured a city within Russia's borders. Although the Ukrainian army has previously conducted their operations within Russian borders, this is the first time a ground operation has infiltrated Russian territory. Belgorod, located on Russia's Ukrainian border, is recognized as the Russian Army's coordination center. The Russian Legion of Freedom's pro-Ukrainian forces managed to enter Belgorod borders and conquered 2 border towns in this region. The regional governor of Belgorod acknowledged that battles are still ongoing and that the Ukrainian army has taken control of 2 towns. In a statement, the commander of the Russian Legion of Independence stated that they will continue to carry out these attacks in order for Russia to rid itself of the Putin tyranny and restore its independence. Pro-Ukrainian commanders who have stated that they will continue the push on Russian territory very soon frightened Vladimir on Tuesday because the Ukrainian army successfully captured territory within Russia's borders for the first time.